Good morning. Thank you for joining us again for this next portion of our series of examining whether it's logical to believe in a creator or not. This is the 13th part of our ongoing series. We'll have this and one more, and that will wrap it up. And I am just appreciative of the privilege of spending this time with you and getting to do this. And also, I'm very grateful that you have invested your time in this. We did miss a couple of weeks back, because of some sickness and overwhelming workload and technical problems here, but I think we're back on track. So if you did miss anything, you can pull those previous lessons up on the archives. And if there are parts that you didn't see, you may want to go back and look at those, because some of this, of course, won't make a lot of sense without some of the things that preceded it, even though we do try to do just a little bit of introductory review each time. If you're watching this on its first broadcast, it's September the 20th, and we hope that the oncoming fall season is good to you. We're back in swing with in-person meeting at Creve Hall and have several things going at once. But we certainly wanted to finish this series out and try to do it some kind of justice because of the importance of what we're looking at. So as we continue looking at whether it makes logical sense in light of science, evidence, logical belief, to think that there is a superior entity or a creator behind all that we see, we've said that this is really one of the big questions that every human needs to answer. No matter what you think about it, no matter what you think you might think about it, we all need to know confidently whether or not it makes sense to believe that there is a superior entity, a designer, a creator, a God. And so we've broken down the questions to be answered into four major questions. We won't spend much time on this because if you followed the series, you're familiar with this. But on this last one, the diversity, complexity, and precision of life that we see on Earth, we're looking at the competing theses or hypotheses or theories on this. Number one, that there was a superior entity, a God who designed and created. An alternative to this that will be theistic evolution, that is evolution, but with the initial life placed here by a creator. Or the primary atheistic theories, evolution, macroevolution, or neo-Darwinism by natural selection. Or the alternative to that, another atheistic theory of punctuated equilibrium, another type of evolution that we looked at some, especially in last week's discussion. Well, just in briefest review to bring you back up to where we are, then we're looking now, we're right in the middle of a look at the evidence for and against the evolutionary theory. And I mean by that primarily the gradualism or neo-Darwinism or macroevolution theory. We're looking to see, based on the evidence, does it have credibility? Does the evidence support it? Does it make more sense and have greater explanatory power than any of these other competing hypotheses? And we're not going to accept it or reject it based on assumptions or what we wish to believe or not believe. I don't know anything that could be more fair and more logical from an intellectual and scientific standpoint than to look at the evidence for and against the theory. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're in, here's where we are if you're kind of looking at an outline of this, of evolution. We looked at the unique premises and treatment of the theory, and we will come back to that as we wrap up. We looked at some of the foundational assumptions that are usually given as the basis for believing it. Most people don't ever look at the evidence for or against, and in fact, as you will see me illustrate again next week, it's usually discouraged for you to actually look at the evidence. If you can believe that, we wouldn't do that in any other area of scientific inquiry, but we're looking at a critical analysis of the evidence in a few different parts. So the way we broke that up is we looked at the affirmatively supporting, hypothesis-specific evidence, missing evidence, contradictory evidence, shifting evidence. We looked at those things up through last week. And here's kind of where we've been with that, just in a brief whirlwind. As far as the hypothesis-specific confirmatory evidence, the fact is there's not any. The fact is that all of the evidence that's typically claimed as illustrating evolution, that is animals and organisms that are just so perfectly, amazingly adapted to their environment, all of those things are at least as compatible with a design hypothesis as they are with evolution. And there really isn't, it truly is not any uniquely, affirmatively supporting evidence for the evolutionary theory. Now, I know some people would be very indignant at that and shocked and say, well, what do you mean there's not any? There's not. And we looked at that, and I would encourage you, if you have any doubt, or if you, again, just want a springboard for your own further research, go back and take a look at what we've said about that. Next, we looked at the missing evidence, and the idea is this. If Darwin's theory is correct, and especially now that we've had it for 160 years, there are a lot of things that we really ought to have very firmly supporting evidence for in the fossil record, with examples of beneficial mutations occurring, new features and functions. We should have some good, unambiguous, clearly documented examples of these things if that theory is correct. But we don't have any of that. We don't have the supporting fossil evidence. It's not there. It's noticeably absent, completely absent of the type of evidence that would support Darwin's theory. And he knew that this was a problem and said, if you don't find it eventually, then you'll have to reject my theory. Okay? And it's not there. We still haven't found it, and we haven't found any of these examples of randomly produced new features and functions. We have neither of these things. But we're told now that the fossil record does support the theory. Well, it doesn't. They just decided to let's quit talking about it because we don't want to hear that anymore. And obviously I'm ascribing a generalization to a large group of people, but I think you'll find that the lack of evidence in the fossil record, it's not only a glaring discrepancy, but a fatal flaw to the theory, and that's why nobody wants to look at it. They want to just say, well, it doesn't matter whether we find it or not. Okay? But we're also missing these examples of beneficial mutations, as we talked about. Well, we then went on to the contradictory evidence. That is evidence that not only doesn't support evolution, but actually argues against it. And some of the evidence straddles both of those categories. We looked especially in the last session at what gradualism evolutionists claim with this tree of life, suppose this is the sequence of how all the different plants and animals came from, etc. But as Dr. Stephen Jay Gould pointed out, we don't have any of that. He pointed out that none of those transitional forms exist. Nobody has ever found evidence of them. We looked at that in some detail. So again, I would encourage you, if you didn't hear that, to go back and take a look at those. The information is exceedingly important. What Dr. Gould pointed out is, he was an atheist, he was an evolutionist, he just pointed out that Darwin's theory didn't work, that there must be some other kind of evolution, and so he gave us the idea of punctuated equilibrium, and that is this: that the fossil record does not show gradual transitions as Darwin's theory would demand. Instead, what happens is new forms of life, new organisms, animals, etc., they appear very abruptly in the fossil record. They appear fully formed, not transitional. They appear at their very first appearance. They're in their final complex form, and then they don't change. There is stasis, staying the same, until finally they are extinct, or we still see them today. So he called this punctuated equilibrium, that is long periods of no change, punctuated by brief upheavals where all kinds of new things appear all at once. And so what Dr. Gould and his partner Eldridge observed, there's no observed pattern of any transitional connection between anything at all. Instead, the fossil record shows just what we described just a moment ago, and an explosion of life with no precursors or ancestors that are apparent in the fossil record. So what Dr. Gould pointed out fits the evidence that we see, which also looks eerily like what you would expect if the creation hypothesis is correct, but he offered no mechanism for how that could have happened that way. So Mr. Darwin offered us a mechanism that turns out not to be consistent with what's in the evidence. Dr. Gould offers us an honest look at the evidence, but has no explanation for how that happened. So the fossil evidence that has to exist for the widely held theory of macroevolution to be true is completely missing. And further, what we do find in the fossils and life fully contradicts the theory, but would fit perfectly with the creation hypothesis instead. But that's not the only fatal flaw. There are more, as we've said. And we have to look at all of the evidence. And so we went in and looked at what I call the shifting evidence. That is, things that used to be considered proof for evolution and are usually still claimed to be, but as we understand them more and more, they don't fit with evolution at all. They've shifted into the category of actually contradictory things. Now, we said natural selection is a well-proven phenomenon, but natural selection, that is, if you have two organisms competing with each other for predominance, one of them is better suited to the prevailing conditions than the other one, well, it will prevail. It will predominate, at least for the present time, but that can't explain the appearance of new things in organisms. We looked at some examples, and I just wanted to say a word about this because we went through this so rapidly last time. There is, in all of these examples, the development of resistance to antibiotics among bacteria, the development of resistance to pesticides in some insects, and the production of antibodies in humans and other animals, etc. We showed that this is not the product of random mutations, not at all. There are actually areas in the genome of these organisms that are called hypervariable regions. That is, they constantly crank out new combinations of things, just like trying all possible combinations for a lock or a safe that you would like to open. In fact, that would be very, very consistent with design, although I'm not saying it has to be. But they're constantly doing this, and then when they find the right combination, they share it with other organisms, the bacteria do with plasmids, but there is no accumulating change. In these changes, and you could call them mutations, although they appear to be programmed mutations, but there's no accumulating change. They don't produce anything new, not ever, not even over millions of years perhaps, if they've been there that long. They don't produce anything new because there is no sequential accumulating change as per Darwin's theory. We also looked at some other things. In fact, the one that started it all with Mr. Darwin, the beak size and shape on the finches on the Galapagos Islands, and what's usually said about these, and you'll still hear it today, although it's thoroughly disproven at this point as of a few years ago, that, well, if we can see, the size and shape of these bird beaks changing, very rapidly in response to changes in the food supply, etc., well, then that just shows you, no matter how unlikely it is, there's evolution happening in real time right in front of your eyes. So it's just easy as anything then to say, well, if you can see that much change in just a few years, well, how much change could you get over millions of years? You could get, from bacteria to humans, etc. The problem is, we now know it's not evolution at all. What has been known for a while now is that let's take the finch beak example. They don't change over time. It's just that there's a repertoire or a library of beak sizes and shapes in those birds, and they just kind of cycle around. In fact, an evolutionary author who wrote an entire book on this subject said they don't really change, they just wobble about a phenotypic average or mean. That is to say, this year, you'll see more birds with longer beaks. Next, 5 years from now, if the food supply changes, you might see more of them with the thin beaks, etc., better suited for eating different things. But the fact is, over time, they just cycle around among those, just like if you look at old photographs of your ancestors, you'll see certain appearances that pop up over and over again. But there's no accumulating change. They just go round and round with the same collection of beak sizes and shapes. There's no new function. There's no eventual change. There is no evolution. In fact, over a long period of time, there's no change at all. I think you get the picture, but I wanted to emphasize that because we covered it so hurriedly last time. And therefore, in all of these examples we looked at, there's no accumulating change, there's no new function or anatomic feature. This fully, completely contradicts the neo-Darwinism evolutionary theory or macroevolution or gradualism. And furthermore, the discovery of this phenomenon of epigenetics as the real cause in many of these, with no eventual change at all, well, that definitely blows up the idea that you can extrapolate the evolution of the human race based upon a short-term change in the beaks of these finches. You cannot extrapolate that at all because it's not evolution. That is completely debunked. And you know that, but nobody else is going to tell you that. But I encourage you to research it for yourself, or I'd be glad to talk to anybody about it. And it's just a complete contradiction of the evolutionary theory. So I've called those examples shifting evidence because these were the very things that were supposed to exemplify evolution in action right under our noses in real time. And these were supposed to predict its large-scale occurrence, but they actually turn out to be a completely different phenomenon, not evolution at all. It contradicts macroevolution, and it predicts the absence of any long-term change, not the occurrence of long-term change. And it certainly doesn't and cannot predict any accumulating change in new species. We still do not see those things happening, and I can't emphasize that enough. But that brings us then to the next area I'll call the rational convincing mechanisms for evolution. But I wish there were any for us to look at. Instead, what we have is the absence of any rational convincing mechanisms. Consider this: a well-founded and ultimately valid hypothesis, certainly a major theory like evolution, it should rest on a convincing and rational, very sensible mechanism, biologically, everything. And then it should be supported by strong evidence that shows that mechanism and that hypothesis to be correct, and it shouldn't be contradicted by any of it. In fact, if it's contradicted, then you've either got to abandon the theory or modify it to make up and to avoid the contradiction. But so far, we've seen repeated instances of the necessary evidence for evolution being completely absent, as well as theory-killing, fatal flaws, contradictions in the abundant evidence that we do have. So that is to say, the evidence that you have to be consistent with evolution is all missing. The evidence that we do have, which is a lot, actually contradicts the evolutionary theory. But nevertheless, the theory continues to be widely accepted based upon the premise that, well, it could happen. It could happen, so it did. The evidence shows that the proposed mechanism of natural selection from an unending sequence of beneficial mutations doesn't happen. And it didn't happen. We've shown that very clearly, even with our brief overview of this. And the theory of evolution further falls apart when we begin to look at the greater complexity of life. We've looked at little things, tiny little examples that disprove it. But when we start looking at more complex things in life, it falls apart even further. The mechanisms that are proposed for evolution are so vague and so contrary to known principles and evidence and occurrence in biology as to just be completely nonsensical. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but it's really, really true. The mechanisms that are proposed for evolution just don't make any sense if you know any biology, if you know any mathematics, etc. And time after time, there's not even a rational, specific proposal for a workable mechanism that could produce some of the complex things that we see. You know, the ongoing claims of, well, it could happen, it could happen. Well, it looks even less rational and more desperate the more that you examine these things. Well, we'll briefly consider just a small handful of examples because of such tight constraints on our time. I know you don't want to study this subject forever, and so I have to apologize again. We're not taking the time to really do justice to this, but I do hope that we're at least introducing you to what some of the pertinent areas are, so that if you want to look into it further, you'll know where to start reading and where to start looking. We could talk hundreds of hours about each of these things. But we'll take just a handful of examples. I think you'll get the idea. And you know that there are hundreds more. Actually, we could say there are thousands more examples, just like the ones that we could look at. Well, one of the most critical discrepancies in the evolutionary theory is the lack of any rational proposed explanation, any mechanism for the addition of genetic material. Let me tell you what I mean. You know that the basis of Darwin's theory and the modern synthesis of it, taking into account genetic knowledge that we have now, the idea is that most genetic mutations are either harmful or fatal, sometimes neutral, not known to be beneficial. However, the idea is, but you know, every once in a while you do get a beneficial one, and you get enough of those stacking on top of each other, and that's going to give you new anatomic features and new functions and new organisms and new species and, you know, et cetera. Eventually bacteria to humans. Here's the problem with that. Think about this. If you mutate a DNA base pair while DNA is reproducing, well, even if it doesn't cause harm, et cetera, that doesn't give you new DNA. It doesn't give you additional amounts of DNA. It just gives you the same amount of DNA that you already had, and it's now mutated. Okay, and we've talked about how that usually doesn't work out, and we don't have known examples of anything new being produced by it, actually, any new feature or function, any clear examples. But never mind that for the moment. Let's move on to another problem with it. That's what I'm saying here. This is yet another problem. But let's say that you have a very simple gene, very, very simple gene that's, you know, 10 DNA base pairs long, and it replicates, and one of them is mutated. It's distorted or corrupted in the reproduction process, and it doesn't get repaired by the cell. Well, now you have still 10 base pairs of DNA, 9 of them correct, 1 mutated. But you don't have another chromosome. You don't have an extra gene. You have the same amount of genetic material you already had, and now it's even defiled a little bit. It's corrupted. But let's just take a typical bacteria, a prokaryote, E. coli, Escherichia coli. It's used in all kinds of medical research, and you hear contaminating water supplies from time to time, et cetera. So you've heard of E. coli, okay? E. coli is a bacteria that has 1 chromosome. It's a circular piece of DNA. It has, amazingly, 3,000 genes just to run that bacteria. I think that's pretty amazing. We talk about simple life. Even the simplest life is really amazingly complex. But anyway, okay, there are 3,000 different genes that have been identified in the E. coli genome on 1 chromosome. And those consist of about 4 million DNA base pairs, okay? So, look, as an aside, how in the world are you going to get that to evolve? You can't. But let's say you did. Okay, it came from somewhere. E. coli, 3,000 genes, 4 million DNA base pairs on 1 chromosome. But a human, a normal human, has 23 pairs of chromosomes, all of them exceedingly more complex. There are 20,000 to 25,000 genes, and you might say, well, wait a minute, we've mapped the whole human genome. Why don't they know? Because it's still too complex for us to completely map. There are believed to be between 20 to 25,000 functional genes, and then there are huge areas of the DNA that nobody has yet figured out what they do. That will come up in our discussion next week, okay? But we know there are at least that, and some of them actually do double duty, et cetera, which is quite ingenious. 3 billion base pairs of DNA. Well, that's a whole lot more than E. coli, isn't it, that we supposedly came from some similar bacteria, et cetera. So even if everything was going well and all of these mutations are being beneficial, that doesn't get you any additional DNA. And we've somehow, if we want to explain where the human came from, we've somehow got to get from 3,000 genes to maybe 25,000. That's kind of a difference. 1 chromosome up to 46, 23 pairs of chromosomes. 4 million DNA base pairs up to 3 billion. That's a lot of new DNA, a lot of added genetic material. And there's no rational explanation for that happening. Huge problem for evolution. Actually a fatal flaw, another in the growing list of fatal flaws for this theory. Well, the typical explanation, if you ask an evolutionist, well, then how can that happen? Because mutations don't produce new DNA. Here's the best explanation, and it really falls under this same kind of, I hate to say it, but kind of intellectually desperate category of it could happen, it could, we don't have any evidence for it, but it could, so it did. Here's the idea, is that there were mistakes made, multiploidy, that is, extra chromosomes when a cell was reproducing. Instead of reproducing the correct number of chromosomes and genes, it got an extra one, okay? And it got 2 copies of something that it should have only gotten 1 copy of that gene or that chromosome. And therefore, now you've got an extra chromosome to work with, and yeah, it's identical to the one there, and yeah, that's usually fatal, almost always, or badly damaging. But, let's just say that it happened and it turned out to be really good. So now you've got 2 chromosomes that you can mutate instead of just 1. And then, maybe 1,000 years later, it happens again, and now you've got 3 chromosomes that you can mutate, and you can get all kinds of great stuff, etc. Multiploidy. Instead of being euploid, that is the normal number of chromosomes and genes, you get some multiple of that by mistake, and it turns out to be, again, another very fortunate mistake. Problem with that is that multiploidy, or the inclusion of an extra duplicated chromosome, is usually fatal. Many stillborn children, if they're analyzed, the tissue is analyzed from that fetus, from that stillborn fetus, it will show that they had extra chromosomes. Some of those children actually survived to birth with extra chromosomes. For example, what we often call Down syndrome is trisomy 21. Trisomy, that is, instead of 2 copies of chromosome 21, that child got 3 copies of chromosome 21. It wasn't fatal, but it leads to difficulties. There are other, now trisomy 21 or Down syndrome happens to be one of the few that many of the children can actually survive. And of course, many of us know beautiful individuals with Down syndrome who are wonderful people that we hold precious, etc., but they will tell you they have challenges in life. There are other trisomies. Most of them are actually not compatible with survival at all. And again, those babies are often stillborn or miscarried, unfortunately. Multiploidy, that is the accidental inclusion of an extra copy of a gene or chromosome, it usually doesn't go very well. But here's the thing. The explanation then that, well, there was an accidental extra copy of a chromosome included and then it mutated like the other good mutations, we have no evidence of this. It's never been observed, needless to say, and it's completely contrary to all known biology. If you want to believe it, you'll be believing it against all logic and evidence, but at least I guess you could say, well, it could happen. Well, you can say it could happen. Again, if you want to contradict and ignore all known biology and evidence. But there's no reasonable explanations for plenty of other things too. That's a huge, glaring problem with missing mechanism. But think about some others. We'll talk about them just ever so briefly. Think about plants and animals supposedly coming from the same ancestor. Here's a problem. Plants require carbon dioxide to live, and they can't live without it. And then they take energy from sunlight, and one of their waste products is oxygen that they release into the atmosphere. Animals, as you know, require oxygen to live and will be dead within moments without a supply of oxygen. They can't produce it. We can't produce it for ourselves. In fact, we have to get it from plants that produce it. And then, as a waste product, we give off carbon dioxide, which is what plants require to survive. So if you're going to have both of those from a common ancestor, there's no good explanation for how that happens. And it had to happen exactly simultaneously or everything dies. We could talk further about it, but I think you see there's a big problem there. Here's another one, kind of along the same lines. And I don't mean by any means to be graphic or offensive to anyone, not at all, but this is biology we're talking about, okay? There is no rational evolutionary explanation for the development of sexual reproduction among both animals and plants, okay? Bacteria reproduce asexually, that is, a bacteria just divides and makes another copy of itself. But most animals and most plants actually reproduce with sexual reproduction involving a male and a female. Compared to bacterial asexual reproduction, it's a very inefficient process. Now, I know that the population would say, well, it works pretty well, and it does. But it's actually biologically very inefficient. It would not have had a survival advantage, much more efficient to let a bacteria just make a copy of itself. But to get sexual reproduction, let's think about in an animal, it requires not just that evolution, this completely nonsensical anti-evidence theory, it doesn't just require that evolution take place. Now you have to have two separate, simultaneous, but perfectly matched double evolution. You've got to have two evolutionary tracks happening at the same time, a male and a female, and all of them keeping perfect pace, because one can't work and cannot reproduce without the other. Imagine if animals had split into a male and female, and then the male didn't further evolve any reproductive things. Now, you may think the male evolved without any brain. Sometimes we don't seem to use our brains, the male half of the species. I'm as guilty as anybody, but we all have our weird things, don't we? But what if only the female evolved and it didn't happen in the male? And you're talking about random now, all random, of course, no guidance to this process. Well, how lucky that both the male and the female both evolved to match each other with function, physiology, behavior, anatomy, etc., all of which really looks like it was designed to work together. But there's no good way, even if you believe the rest of evolution, there's no rational way to explain getting the male and the female to both evolve simultaneously and perfectly synchronously matched at every step with extremely complex male and female reproductive anatomy and physiology and behavior. There's just no rational explanation for it. And I'm sorry, the fact that, well, we're here, so it must have happened, that doesn't work. We've talked about why that defies all logic and intellectual honesty. There are no reasonable explanations by the evolutionary theory for plenty of other phenomena too, like the simultaneous development of advanced anatomy and the know-how in birds and other flying animals. Take a little, I guess they're sparrows maybe, you know, the ones that live in the parking lot at Walmart and eat French fries or whatever, I guess, et cetera, or they live their whole lives in the garden center at Home Depot. In fact, I think Jesus said you could buy two of them for just a few coins. What an amazing thing, though. You think about just the simplest little bird. Unbelievable anatomy. All-terrain, immediate vertical takeoff and landing, retractable landing gear that also function to walk on when they're on the land. Do you know any airplanes that are not modeled on the bird? Of course they are. in every way. Think about what birds can do, though. They go and find their own fuel. They complete most of their own repairs. They actually produce the next generation of flying machines when they have their baby chicks. But look at what they can do. Wings perfectly shaped, perfectly angled for flight. Have you ever watched some of maybe the hawks or eagles just soaring, just gliding, etc., land exactly where they want at any time? How did that happen? And the anatomy, you realize, is of zero use without all of the know-how that is built into their little brains, in the DNA of their brains, automatically. They know how to fly. They know how to turn. They know how to land. They know how to put their landing gear down. There's no reasonable explanation for the simultaneous development of all of the complex anatomy. That would take billions of years by itself if you could even get it to evolve, which you can't. The logic and the evidence shows. And knowing what to do with that anatomy. If you put those wings on me, they'd be useless, wouldn't they? Wouldn't know what to do with them, because that's not built into my DNA, but it is into theirs. Just one more example of things that defy evolutionary explanation. But there are many, many others, and I want to introduce you to a concept here. If you ever study human anatomy and physiology, the examples come up by the thousands. Let me mention just one group of them, though. Thyroid hormones or other endocrine hormones. You have a pituitary gland and a hypothalamus, and then adrenal glands and thyroid glands and all of the others, ovaries and testes, etc., releasing different chemicals. Many of them with not just feedback control loops, but double feedback control loops. Incredibly complicated, very precise. I'll tell you, to any logical mind, it has careful design stamped all over it. Not just careful, but ingenious design. And there's no rational way to explain how those things could evolve with multiple levels of complexity that don't work without the other. The coagulation cascade, it's often called, allowing your blood to clot when it needs to clot, but to not clot and remain liquid when clotting would be a bad thing. There is a cascade of about 10, at least what we know of, there may be more than that, but we've discovered about 10 different proteins, you might say, involved in this coagulation sequence. And they all have to work just right, or the thing doesn't work. Have you heard of somebody who has hemophilia? They might have factor VIII hemophilia because they don't produce one of those that we call factor VIII. And until modern times, they had a very short lifespan because they would bleed to death. We now know what to do about that, but they still have a difficult life, etc. But all of these different proteins work beautifully to carry out this function. And yet, all of them are useless without all of the others simultaneously in place. How, even if you could have evolution, how do you evolve 10 different proteins at the same time, none of which have any advantage if you don't have the other 9? And they all have to be perfect or they don't work. And they're all complicated molecules. It makes no sense whatsoever. The usual explanation from evolution is, well, maybe one of those, it was a different protein that did something else. So that's why it already existed. And then it mutated, and it just so happened that it really became useful in the coagulation process. It defies all logic. It defies all intellectual honesty. It defies biology. It's contrary to everything that we actually know to be true. It doesn't work. It's a desperate excuse instead of a rational explanation. Dr. Michael Behe put a term on this Things that are very, very complex can't be made, they don't work if you take away any part of them. If you make them any less complex, they're useless and they don't work. And therefore, there's no rational way that you could say that all the parts of something evolved at the same time. Dr. Michael Behe put a term on that idea, called it irreducible complexity. Things that can't be made less complex or they don't work. And there's no good way you can get all of those things to just happen to evolve all at the same time. Wrote a book about this, and there is no good counter to it. You'll hear people say, oh no, we've debunked that whole irreducible complexity thing. No, they haven't. Look at it for yourself. The so-called explanations to overcome this problem in evolutionary theory are just completely nonsensical. Almost laughably so if this were not such serious business. It's one of the huge, huge problems, but as you've seen, it's just another on a series of fatal flaws. Here's probably still the most daunting one of all. If we had more time, I would go into a long explanation of it. I would show you what Darwin said about it. He realized this idea of incredibly complex structures, very finely tuned, and realized, yes, this is a problem. But said, but if you could get it to happen a little bit at a time, then maybe you could have this happen. The formation of the human eye, the original, the ultimate still, high-definition optical instrument. You know, when you get a high-definition television and then they came out with a 4K ultra-high definition, you can only tell the difference because your eye is many, many times higher definition than that. Apple put what they called a retina display on their phones a few years back. It's really, really good. Not nearly as good as the retina. In fact, the reason you can tell the difference is because your retina is so much more precise, etc. We won't have time to go into it, but you can read all the quotes. You can read all the accusations of misquoting out of context. You can consider all the arguments, and you should. I wish I did have time to go into this in detail and look at it. Richard Dawkins, very famous evolutionary thinker and author, put forth the idea. He says, well, it's really not so hard. He did this in his book called The Blind Watchmaker, and also in another book of his called Climbing Mount Improbable. He said, well, yes, the human eye looks very complex, and it is, but you could get there by evolution. He says, well, you know, what if you had an animal that had maybe just, it evolved a light-sensing spot, you know, that it could tell when there was light or not, and this would be a big survival advantage. And then later, well, maybe a little dimple formed over that by some evolution, and before long, that dimple turned into a lens, and it then evolved some gel in the middle of this encased thing, etc. And he goes, so you know, you could certainly get the eye from that. It seems improbable, but obviously it happened. The problem is, and I can show you this if we had time to get into it, every one of those steps requires 10,000 other steps in between that he didn't bother to mention or try to explain or account for. I'm going to tell you, and I'm not being facetious actually, what I'm about to propose actually is more likely than that. It would be almost like saying, and I showed you several weeks back about abiogenesis, the idea of a lawnmower in my driveway fashioning itself into a Lamborghini over some period of time. But you could take this with Dawkins's explanation of the evolution of the eye and say, well, yeah, well, it didn't turn into a Lamborghini all at once. You know, first of all, a lawnmower appeared. Oh, okay. Yeah, never mind how that happened. You're just supposed to believe it. Just like a light-sensitive spot appeared. I can show you a really nice reference of how many thousands of steps would have to be involved because of the biology of a light-sensitive spot. That doesn't happen. And so, well, then the lawnmower, first it just changed into a go-kart, you know. And then the go-kart changed into a Volkswagen Beetle, you know. And then the Beetle changed into a liquid-cooled, you know, car engine, etc., and several more steps until finally you have the finely tuned Lamborghini. Yeah, well, what about all the steps in between? When you read Dawkins's explanation of how the eye could have evolved, and you go back to Darwin's admission that yes, it seems highly improbable. I'm going to leave it at that. I don't wish to misquote anybody, and I don't wish to be accused of it. Darwin knew it was a big problem. He said, but maybe if you had enough finely graduated steps, you could get it to happen. And Dawkins says, well, yeah, there have been a lot of finely graduated steps. It's perfectly reasonable, except that we don't have any of them. We have no evidence for it. It's strictly conjecture. It's strictly Darwin or Dawkins saying, well, yeah, it could happen. In a series of steps, it could happen. Okay, what are the steps? There's no evidence. There's no details. There's no actually rational explanation at all. And you can try to say, oh, that problem's been solved. No, it hasn't. It hasn't even been remotely approached. And you just can't get it to work. There's also no reasonable explanation for the appearance of structures and physiology which are extremely complex but don't confer any survival advantage. Now, we're not getting into vestigial organs yet. That comes next week. But think about your eyebrows. Very complex that they should grow like they do. They were once considered a vestigial organ. Again, we'll come revisit that next week. Think about this, though, and again, I'm not trying to be graphic here, but think about it. We're talking about biology here. Do you know what sphincter muscles are? These are circular muscles they act like valves to shut something or open it. So sphincter muscles, birds don't have them, and so whenever their GI tract produces waste material, it's expelled right then and there because there's nothing to stop it. Well, a lot of animals, including humans, do have sphincter muscles, both in the gastrointestinal tract and at the bladder, the kidneys and the bladder. It's really nice to be able to have some control over when you would like to visit a restroom, rather than your body just immediately take and continuously expelling its waste material. And that's a very complex system. Especially on the urinary sphincter muscles. There are two different ones, not just one. You can't explain it by evolution, even if you could get a series of steps that could lead to the formation of those structures and the nerves that can control them voluntarily, etc. Very, very complex system, mind-blowing, and that's just that one little thing. But it doesn't actually confer a survival advantage. So why would it have ever developed? Except by design, it makes perfect sense. How about color vision? You don't need color vision for survival. And boy, you talk about a very complicated system to give you ultra-high definition color vision, not just the vision that would give you a survival advantage. There's no good explanation for it. And it's so complex, there's no way for it to happen by random mutations. Many aspects of human reproductive function, we talked a little bit about that, but many of them, they don't have a survival advantage. You can't explain the behavior, et cetera, in that way. Even if you could biologically get it to be produced, it defies the evolutionary theory. Hundreds of other examples that we could go into that strongly imply design and lack any reasonable evolutionary explanation. Here's the fact. Every area we look at consistently supports one conclusion. And so as we move into the next part of our outline, our concluding analysis, well, let's look at what that conclusion is. Every area we look at consistently supports one conclusion. Evolution does not fit the evidence, not even remotely, not by any conjecture. There's no intellectually sound, reasonable way to still say it could have happened, because the evidence will show that it didn't. The incredible complexity and precision of life, overwhelmingly indicative of design, suggests that random mutation instead is not a reasonable conclusion. A study of biology and genetics shows that the evolutionary theory is not plausible in the least. The mathematics of it shows that it couldn't even begin to happen, even if you could give the proposed age of the entire universe thousands of times over. You couldn't get it to happen. You can conjecture, but all the proofs from every direction are solid and consistent. And they speak clearly to any rational mind that it couldn't have happened by evolution. There's simply no way. But even far more than that, far more importantly, the biology, the math, everything intellectual shows you that it couldn't have happened. But here's what's really important. The evidence shows conclusively that it didn't happen. It just didn't happen, no matter how much you try to say, well, it could happen. Well, even if you could convince yourself that it could happen, the evidence says it didn't happen. And I don't know what could be more fair than looking at the evidence. Although, as you'll see me say next week, there are now a lot of people saying, well, we need to quit looking at the evidence. We need to just accept this. Okay, because we know it's fact, so we need to quit looking at the evidence, quit trying to falsify it. Gradualism, that is the evolutionary theory, offers an extremely vague mechanism. Never, ever will you get the details filled in. It's just whatever needed to happen, well then, that's what happened. But the vague mechanism that we have is shown not to work and not to have happened. Dr. Gould's alternative of punctuated equilibrium, it fits the evidence that we see, but it offers absolutely no proposed mechanism, no explanation at all of how it supposedly happened. And Dr. Gould was staunch that there was no creator, there was no God. It happened somehow by evolution, but what he showed was it didn't happen by Darwin's theory, and I don't have another theory for how it did happen, but we know it happened by evolution. Please pardon me if I just don't find that very convincing from any kind of a logical or scientific standpoint. It just doesn't fit the evidence. But what about theistic evolution? The idea that, well, okay, it's a kind of a hybrid theory, and it's held by many, many fine people. The idea is, okay, you can't explain the origin of the universe with all of its matter and energy without a creator. There had to be a creator. You can't really explain the precise arrangement of the universe and this planet being so uniquely and unlikely suitable for life without a creator. So there had to be a creator for that. Third, abiogenesis, it's a myth, as we've well found it to be. It's a myth. You can't get life to come from dead chemicals without a creator. So there was a creator for that. But the idea is, so there was a creator who did those three things, but instead of forming these animals and these plants and specific creation in final form, what he did was create the most primordial primitive life on this planet, and then turned it loose and let evolution shape it into what we see today. Therefore, theistic evolution. So what about that? A lot of people find that to be kind of a satisfying theory. They say, well, we want to believe in evolution because overwhelmingly the scientific world seems to believe in evolution, but we know those first three things don't make any sense. So what about that? We'll pick that up next week. And we'll look at a few other things and close out our discussion on all of this. Thank you for being with us again today. I hope that you find this useful, profitable to you, and a springboard for more reading and contemplation and research perhaps. And I hope you have a great week until we see you 1 week from now.